أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear brothers and sisters. I hope you're well this evening and welcome to the third episode of Ramadan Real Talk. It's great to have you with us here this evening for what should be a fascinating panel with two prominent young gentlemen from our community. Ramadan Real Talk is a series of discussions and important conversations that we are holding as National Zakat Foundation Australia over the course of Ramadan this year. It seeks to look at issues which are often not discussed in our community and to lift the lid on important conversations that we should be having more of. The idea is that after you've prayed your Tarawih this year, you strap in with a cup of coffee or tea and get ready for what have been so far fascinating conversations on a range of important issues. Tonight's episode is on the concept of young Muslim and lost. How do I help my Ummah? And the idea behind this is that we are exploring how young Muslims who have zeal, energy, passion for Islam can contribute to what is a pretty challenging situation that Muslims all around the world face and that the wider Ummah and its situation confronts at the moment. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here tonight. Obviously the show would not be possible without you. We've had a fantastic response to the first few episodes and we very much hope you are all enjoying what we are doing with this series and look forward to having you with us for the rest of the series as well. Just a little bit about the National Zakat Foundation for those of you who may not be familiar with the organisation. NZF Australia has existed since 2013 and is the Australian branch of NZF International, which is a global Muslim NGO which is seeking to channel the blessings of Zakat collected from Muslims in the West back into our local communities. NZF Australia recently reached the significant milestone of $10 million of Zakat distributed locally to important pressing priorities where Muslim brothers and sisters are eligible to be Zakat recipients, whether they be sufferers of domestic violence, whether they be refugees, widows, single mothers, people who are homeless, really people in our community who, if it was not for National Zakat Foundation, would not have any sort of safety net whatsoever. NZF's motto is that no Muslim should be left abandoned, and that is the ethos with which it is seeking to work. It is doing absolutely phenomenal work in our community to uplift the conditions of many, many Muslims. And if you have not had the pleasure of giving Zakat locally so far, and you're one of those people who usually look elsewhere, then do consider giving a portion of your Zakat, if not all of it of course, to causes that are important, pressing, right here in our local community. You'd be surprised how many people meet the criteria for Zakat because there are real problems right here in our communities that we need to look after that we're often oblivious to. And those are some of the issues that we have been discussing over the course of the episodes and which we will over what remains. Today's episode is a little bit different in that regard, but nonetheless is important and connotative of the problems and issues that Muslims face locally right here in Australia. I'd like to also thank our community partners and sponsors who are helping us with this series of episodes. I'd like to begin by thanking our brothers and sisters at Dar es Salaam Australia, who have been doing fantastic work in the community by providing Islamic products, books, prayer mats, and all manner of Islamic items. You can see some of the products that are available at Dar es Salaam here with us in the room today, including behind me what I consider a fantastic product, which is the Maqdis Quran Tajweed and Translation in One. It's an absolutely fantastic product for anyone looking to take their Quran to the next level in the month of Ramadan. Also want to thank TLC Disability Services, whose CEO will be joining us in one of the upcoming episodes, and Crescent Wealth, Australia's premier and largest Islamic superannuation fund, and of course Initiative Samarkand, from where many of the discourses and questions that we've raised so far in the series have been drawn. We look forward to having you with us for today's episode as well. Now, without further ado, and so that we can get right into it, let me introduce today's esteemed guests. I've got here with me today my good brothers and friends. Uthman Badr, firstly. Uthman is a da'i, a public speaker and a student of Islam, as well as Western philosophy. He has had a prominent position in the Muslim community and its conversations for some 15 years. He's currently completing his PhD, having most recently completed a Master's in Continental Philosophy. He has spoken widely on a large array of Islamic and political issues, has appeared in the media, and is best known for an outstanding speech that he delivered on free speech and insults to God and his prophets some 10 years ago at one of Sydney's premier cultural events. Brother Muhammad Yassin is a youth leader who is in the guts of activism and da'wah within our community. He's currently a student at studying law at the University of Sydney and was most recently president of the well-known and iconic and much-loved Sydney University Muslim Students Association, SUMSA. He's well respected throughout the Sydney Muslim student population as a leader and an activist, and he is also, mashallah, a hafiz of the Quran. Brothers, assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you.
How are you?
Good. Thanks for having us.
No, absolute pleasure. How's Ramadan been treating you so far?
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. It's been really good. Nice contrast to the last one that we had. That was very much indoors, and many people around the world are still in that state. So alhamdulillah, things for us are back to normal transmission.
Alhamdulillah. Muhammad, what's happening?
Yeah, it's really refreshing to go back to like normal, being on campus and like having iftar with other people. Like it's a good change.
Alhamdulillah. Excellent. So let's get into the episode proper, inshallah. So today's discussion will broach many issues of importance relating to young Muslims, their predicament, some of the conundrums that they face. And obviously, Muhammad, we'll put you in the hot seat as a representative of the Muslim youth somewhat. It's a tall order, and Uthman, with his experience, having been close to this sort of space, will add a lot of value in that regard. So let's begin with a very general question, and I'd like to ask Muhammad, what is it like being a young Muslim at the moment? What's the feeling? And how are young Muslims feeling in the world today? And obviously, I'm giving away my age by excluding myself from that category. But tell us, how is it to be in your shoes right now?
Yeah, so when I thought about this one, it was like tough because it's really hard to generalize. Like it's really hard to give like a natural answer. And I think it's important that like as we talk about youth, we like categorize firstly like the problems that young active Muslims face are very different to like what the vast majority of Muslim youth face. So maybe we can talk about like the activist, or not activist, but like someone that's concerned and trying to work for the deen, some problems there. Something like just generally young Muslims, I think overall there's like lots of pressures and like overall like social pressures, economic pressures, and so forth that they're faced with, as a lot of sort of others in wider society are. And I think in response, by and large, you just find a lot of escapism in a way where like vast majority of youth, like their life is sort of defined by they're doing the motions of a degree or like some qualification, and that's happening and that's hard and difficult, and they've got pressure on that, but then their life is sort of just like gaming or TV shows or anime on the other end of that, like drugs, so like it's just like lots of stuff to escape from those problems. And I think like an enduring feature of that is that Islam is not a very relevant, active part of that conversation or discussion. Like it might be someone's practicing like a thing they do, but it's not like a defining part of their life in the face of all this other pressure and like what their response has been so far. So yeah, like hard to generalize. Like even within that, there's lots of pockets and different spaces. But yeah, I think that might be a good starting point.
Yeah. So one thing that strikes me there is often people who are from the sort of the practicing part of the community, they've got certain discussions happening or certain concerns, but when you step outside of that bubble, reality is very, very different for the tens of thousands of others who would fall within that category. So I guess one very broad question, you sort of touched upon it, is how concerned about Islam and the wider Ummah do you find young Muslims as being? Like, are they worried about their own lives and trying to survive, or do they have this broader concern? Again, it's hard to obviously generalize, but what's your experience with the people you mix with and the circles that you've seen?
Yeah, I think like there's one thing to have just like a concern for the Ummah, for its development, and I think maybe that's like later down the line in some way. But I think like the first question is like whether they think like the deen is relevant in their own life, like for their own spiritual practice. I think that's really lacking, where like the deen is something that happens, like you do the motions of it here and there, but it's not like and this is like assuming that you are doing the motions, like lots of people aren't even doing the motions of it, right? So yeah, I think like broadly like the community and the youth aren't as practicing, and this isn't news either, like they're not as practicing as you might think if you look at sort of active cohorts of the community, and like within that there's like lots and lots of problems I think that you can speak to, like drugs, like relationships, like lots of things that can come under that discussion. But yeah, like diagnosing that problem might be a lot.
Yeah. So, I mean, in this series, there are a couple of specific issues which we are looking at through the various episodes and unpacking. I think drugs is one of them, inshallah. We've got a very interesting panel on sort of coming this Sunday. And another one that we've got specifically on Muslim youth and mental health is going to be another one. But I want to pick up on this one, mental health, right, specifically. How big a deal is this with young people today? How big is the struggle? How real is the struggle? Mental health has become a bit of a, I wouldn't call it a fad, but it's become a real point of discussion and a real point of, people realizing that they've got an issue with themselves. In your everyday, at university and in the circles that you move in, how often are youth sort of coming to the realization that they've got some sort of mental health problem? Is that something that's affecting them in their practice of Islam and their practice of the deen and so forth? What's the lived experience?
I think like mental health's tough because it's like the whole like diagnosis versus like now that we have the language for it, like it pops up so much more. I think definitely like people rely on the language of mental illness and depression and anxiety like a lot more. In saying that, like it has, there's a couple of things. So like one thing is that in some way because it's used so like often, it's like in a lot of cohorts of the community, it's lost its meaning. It's lost its meaning. It's also the subject of a lot of self-diagnosis. Like a lot of people will be like willing to just say they're depressed or have anxiety. It's like it's a very like universal thing now. That's one thing. I think a lot of people like talk about it, and we can talk about whether or not it's lost its meaning. Another thing is I think in terms of like the conversation that's played out between like mental health versus religion. Is there a conflict or not? And the baseline of that discussion has changed from what I've seen. Like it's not acceptable anymore to speak about the solution to depression as being praying more. Whether or not like what the actual synthesis of that is beside the point. But as a discourse, I think even among young people, it's not acceptable to give black and white answers anymore. But yeah, it is like it's like a very common like conversation that happens, like people citing themselves as being depressed or concerned about that and so forth. But yeah,
interesting. Want to go over to Uthman now. Uthman, just I guess a general question to start with for you as well. You've been around, the activism and so forth that happens in the community for a long time, and you've seen the ebbs and flows of various epochs, I guess, within the Australian Muslim community. And you started off as quite the young active Muslim yourself, and I think we've forgotten in this conversation that Uthman is your predecessor by some 12, 15 years as president of the same society. So you've seen a lot in what has changed in the Australian Muslim sort of scene, the Western Muslim scene, and so forth. Broadly, what are your reflections on where we are and where we've gotten to over this sort of last 2 decades since you were a wee young lad at university?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Jazakallah khairan. You're making me sound like a 6-year-old or something with 50 years of experience. I think my experience is only relatively long relative to people who I guess are much younger. But yeah, I think my sort of active participation in the Muslim community would have started about 2 decades ago, maybe a little bit less. I think I would say I would locate it when I entered university, as happens for I think a lot of people, which was for me I think 2003. So I mean, in that time a lot has happened, and the question is obviously framed quite broadly. I would say on the whole that many things have changed, some of them for the better, some of them for the worse, but on the whole I think the trajectory is positive. Obviously at some level Muslim numbers have increased, Muslim institutions have increased, availability of knowledge has increased, so all of which is good. And even elsewhere, even where I think some of the issues that we might talk about in terms of confusion amongst the youth and issues in leadership and whatnot, even there I think the trajectory is good, but of course we still have many issues to deal with. So I mean, I remember 2005 it was when John Howard summoned the Muslim leadership at the time. AFIC again was top of the list with I think the chairman at the time was Amjad Mahbub, and obviously they said Labaik Howard, and we went down to Parliament House. So I mean, we moved. Well, I frame it in that way because the point is we've moved quite a bit, even in terms of our leadership. Okay, and some things stay the same. History repeats itself. South Africa is still sort of doing some of its shenanigans in different forms, and maybe slightly better in some ways, or maybe not. But we had the leadership issues. We had other things where a lot of the now our sort of culture war participation back in the day used to be more sort of manhaj wars, sort of Salafi, Sufi and that sort of stuff. You remember, you're 60 years old as well. So it's a very good question. I think overall, I do think the trajectory has been good. I think the community is more aware. I think there's been more dissemination of Islamic knowledge and even of secular worldly knowledges. But of course, there are still many issues out there.
Well, I want to ask one question to Muhammad actually, and maybe this is we would be on a similar page in this regard, but I want to see what Muhammad's perspective is. We grew up for the last 15 years under the shadow of September 11, right? That's the experience that defined what it meant to be a Muslim and the pressure that Islam and Muslims faced. It seems that some of that has dissipated. It really seems in the last 4 or 5 years that constant pressure on Muslims every day on the front of the newspaper, especially when the Syria issue was at its peak for several years. Like, you could not go a day or two without Muslims being absolutely the butt of all national attention. Now you go entire months without stories about Islam and Muslims. It's mind-boggling what that must do for young Muslims today, and the room that it must give to think and go off in different directions and so forth. Muhammad, obviously you weren't in our shoes, so I don't know how you would answer this, but do you feel that the lack of pressure has made Muslims, the problems that you mentioned, is that a result of that they don't have to sort of worry about their Islam and being Muslim so much, so that there's more of a disconnection with what it means to be Muslim? Is that, do you think that that's something that...
Yeah, I think when like 2014, like when ISIS was a lot more of a thing, I was still like late high school, so it definitely was like like being in year 10 and year 9, 10, you do feel that. And then I think in the past 2-3 years, or even a bit more, it's been really, like in Australia especially, apart from like spikes here and there, like it's not very in your face Islamophobia, like it might be more insidious. I definitely agree with that. Whether that comfort is the cause of us, being not as concerned, I don't know. I think possibly, like, I think when you're forced to justify your existence, you might hold on to your identity a lot more, in the face of power. Like, that's definitely true. At the same time, though, a lot of this, I think, is like a lot of the reasons why youth are. I think one of the reasons why, like, people do a lot of like the like they're living their life in like an escapist way where they're not concerned for the deen and so forth. I think that has to do with just the way society is structured generally. Like, it's not necessarily about spikes of Islamophobia, but it's just like haram's so available. You grow up in like this education system where, like, you have certain values and like which are like very like in contrast with the deen. And like even like pressure wise, like there's lots of pressure on you generally. Like all of that pushes you to vice, or makes vice easier at least. I think the Islamophobia point is true though. Like, I think that when that was more of a thing, it did force a bit more like conscious thought about, okay, I'm a Muslim, the identity issue is a lot more clear. Now it's not as much, but I think with like Islamophobia as well, because it's like something that Dr. Yasser Morsi speaks about, which is, so like a lot of times we think about Islamophobia as this, it's like a negative force, so it's like telling Muslims you can't be this, you can't, no to the hijab, no to this, no to that. But in his description, Islamophobia is a productive force as well as telling us what you can be. And I think that is a lot more insidious. So it's like, I think that's still very much at large, where the way Muslims want to be, or like their aspirations for what like a good life looks like, and how their Muslimness fits into that. I think that's still very much so influenced by Islamophobia, the way that like the thought structures it has, and the way Islam's viewed. So yeah, I think yes and no. I think broadly I agree with you.
And Osman, how would you sort of sum up, the last 18, 20 years or whatever since those incidents in America happened? What was it like growing as a young Muslim in the midst of that, and then obviously going to university when Islam was like on the front page every day, and university Muslim students associations were being dragged through controversies for having speakers who address anything vaguely political, and just the pressure on everyone from imams to masajid to leadership bodies to conform to sort of conform to a certain type of Islam was so pressing. How have you sort of dealt with, I guess, that pressure easing? Like, how does that make you feel, and what's the overall sort of reflection on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I agree in large part with Mohammed's assessment. I think there are obviously, you can look at these are all structural issues, and you can look at them at different layers. At a deeper layer, they're not all that important, because the sort of deeper layer here means, like, the fact that we live in a secular age, we live in a liberal world, and those parameters don't change with these ebbs and flows. But then at a closer layer, the layer that's not as deep, they do. And so a lot of the things that you're talking about meant that Muslims were living, and the youth were living in times of heightened attention around them, around the community, around what they do, and that has an impact. Sometimes it's a positive impact because it's impetus for activity, Islamic activity of different types. Sometimes it's different. Sometimes it's an impetus for some people to become insular and to hide away because they don't want to be part of that. They're scared to attend this protest or that event, and so on and so forth. So I think it has different impact on different people. But generally, I agree that the decade, 15 years after 9/11 were times of heightened attention, and it's fallen away for a little bit. I don't think it's gone away permanently. It would come back any time. I think it's more of a sort of stylistic or an approach change that Western states or governments have adopted to some extent. But the border dynamics are still there, but I think because the community also has matured, right? And what that has done, and this is where, like what I spoke about before, with this sort of evolution from your manhaj wars to this sort of American culture wars, it's not random. You can follow some of these trajectories. So, for instance, I think that as the community matured and learned more and more, faced more questions, and realized that some of the things that it were doing were great, but you can only do so much of them. So, for example, a lot of the response to Islamophobia, a lot of the response to Western foreign policy was to point out, the hypocrisies of Western governments and the fact that they're anti-Islam and whatnot. You can only do that so much before you realize, well, okay, where's this going? What's sort of next now? What do we do now, right? So I think there's been some of those trajectories that you've come to something of a dead end, and you've been pushed to then question and think about the bigger picture, because that's something also that heightened attention does. It makes you work in the shorter term. But I think now what we are as a mature community is stepping back and looking at the longer term. So I think there is a bit of quiet, but I think it's positive, and hopefully there'll be positive fruits to that.
I also wanted to say about, in my experience, like if things are like politically tough and there's a lot of pressure on Muslims, I think like on an identity level, like that causes us to like band together a bit and be like, no, this is us, we're Muslims. I don't know if a lot of the like heightened emphasis on retaining our identity necessarily like correlates to like actual genuine like internal change. Like I think you find a lot like people like they're attending more protests, or they're raising their voice a lot, which is good in itself, but whether that has longevity or that's long term, it depends on whether there's actual internal change. I think a lot of times when all of that political organizing and that stuff's happening, doesn't necessarily mean that there is this like internal change, which then turns on the question like, okay, if maybe there's no pressure, and maybe that pressure means we're not forced to justify identity, but that might not mean that there's like a huge change in internal transformative change. So that's another thing.
Yeah, interesting. So I mean, let's touch on some of the interesting things that have been going on in the last little while, and I want to get your perspective, Mohammed, as a young Muslim. So Afiq versus Anik, right? Masjid Noor, and all the crazy stuff that's been happening there, and the plethora of other things that we see in the community. Maybe actually less than we used to, right? Yeah. How do young Muslims perceive that today? Like, a young Muslim, he just wants to practice his deen, or maybe he doesn't, and he's interested. He's not the perfect guy, but or sister. but he generally wants to be a better Muslim, and then he sees this sort of stuff from people who are meant to be leaders. What impact does that have, if any? I mean, it may be that maybe he doesn't care, but is there? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I think no one's surprised. Well, I think the Masjid Nur thing, like, there's the jury's still out. I think, like, it's hard to. You can talk about the responses, but I think no one's surprised at the idea that our leadership is not amazingly working in our interest, or that there's like like I think in the African Anic one, there's like some clear. It's a bit like petty. It's a bit like I think no one's surprised that there's issues, right? In fact, I think like, and this one's tough as well because it came in Ramadan, so a lot of people are actively like saying, I don't want to talk about it in Ramadan, apart from that meme that got shared around. For a lot of people, it's not like it's a non-discussion. But for other people that it is, I think people are just like, oh, that's really bad. But no one's surprised. I think the Masjid Nur one's a bit different. I think if you're actually close to that organization and the personalities involved, then it's a bit more of a thing because you're like, oh, I thought this person was so good. I had so much spirituality. Like, so much of my spirituality was invested in this institution, even though it shouldn't be. But the fact that it is. But just the idea that our leaders aren't, like working in our interests or aren't doing what's best for us. I think that's not very surprising. Yeah.
So let me ask a question then. Who does a young Muslim look to for leadership and inspiration today? Like as a young Muslim yourself, right? If we accept that our appointed leaders or representative councils or whatever are not always going to behave in the way that we would love for them to do so.
Yeah.
Where do you look for inspiration? Where do you look for guidance?
Yeah, like I think there's pockets like like if someone is like Salafi, they're gonna look to their Salafi Mashaykh. If someone's like some more on the path of Tasawwuf and Sufi, they're gonna look to their Mashaykh. So I think there's pockets like I think the vast majority, like in the non-practicing Sufi, like I think there's no central figure institution that you're actually invested in. I think like broadly it's like like this is the Ummah, like this is the community. Like I'll think I'll listen to what the Mufti says about like Eid and so forth. But like beyond that, there's no like overall institution that's setting the narrative for like what should be like form the bedrock that's motivating young people. But again, there's pockets. So like if someone's very involved in a certain institution, the sheikh of that institution is their go-to because they've seen the impacts, they've seen like it's working, and there's probably different reasons to it, but it's more scattered, I guess. There's no unified. No one's looking for like a unified. Yeah. There is a sense that we need more unity. Yeah. But like
it's going to be hard to find.
Yeah. Yeah.
What sort of impact does many of the, and I'm not talking about the recent incident. That's just the most latest one. But there've been others, right? There've been people who the community used to look up to and turned out to be frauds. Yeah. Overseas, not necessarily here. Very well-known leaders, imams, sheikhs. They used to give talk, charismatic. Ends up having a sex scandal. People end up finding they've got multiple wives, or that they led sisters on, and there's all sorts of stuff. I mean, just yesterday there was an article published about a very famous qadi, right? Very well known throughout the world, who was going to visit South Africa, and next minute, people have cancelled because these sexual allegations have come to light. So, how do young Muslims sort of deal with that sort of stuff? Does it dent the notion that there's really no aspirational role model that we can look to, and we can only really look at back in our history, whether it's scholars or companions or Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Is there not really any trust, or is that putting it too skeptically? Like there are good figures that people can say, look, I'm not going to think like that. There are good people in my community, my local imam, my local sheikh, or whatever, that I can look to and say that is a person that I can practically try to emulate.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what Osman was saying about the community maturing. Like I think. I don't think anyone's like fazed or like taken aback by hearing about this broadly, like people that we think are good turning out to be not amazing, but specific personalities, if you're invested in them and they turn out to be bad, then that's a bit of a shock. It's like, oh, what the hell, like I thought this guy was like the best, but I think broadly like people are like everyone's sort of like, I think people get the idea, at least in my circles. Even beyond that, like I do think outside of like practicing circles, like it varies in the community, but I have seen like there's just a general distrust of like mashaykh, like that's just, and that might be for more reasons than just these things that have like these controversies. But I think there is like a general distrust, like mashayikh, like trust him, but like like everyone at the end of the day is looking after themselves. Or like I do hear these like a fair bit. So there's like a general mistrust, and then like no one's that surprised if things go wrong. That's my assessment.
Usman, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think as a description of the way things are, it's pretty accurate. I think generally there is a distrust for obvious reasons of institutional leaderships, whether worldly or more religious ones. And I think, I think Muhammad is on the money in terms of it become more of an individual issue if I'm looking up to this particular individual. Otherwise, the issue is sort of far away, and that sort of speaks to the fact that really our part of the effect of living in a liberal world is that our practice of Islam also has been liberalized in this sense that it's very atomistic, it's very individualistic, it's choice-based. I can go this sheikh and that one and this and that. So I think the more important question is sort of how can we navigate these things? Should it be a concern? Should it be a cause of sort of oh my God, I don't know what to do? And I don't think that should be the case. I think what these episodes reiterate for us is that whilst we need to follow some sheikh or other, we also need to appreciate that we cannot conflate them or the particular view of Islam, the particular version of Islam, version is too strong a word, but the madhab thought, particular school of thought that they follow, confuse that with Islam itself. I think the problem occurs when you do that, or when you ascribe a sort of de facto infallibility to particular figures. And I say de facto because no one in theory is going to say, my sheikh is infallible. All right, Isma's for the prophets, everyone's going to affirm sort of, the doctrinal points, but sometimes there is a de facto way in which you're treating a particular sheikh or an emir of an organization or a movement, etc. And that's where the problem is. In one of the recent controversies, there was a particular articulation of a version of events that a brother was mentioning about, how he came to see that particular sheikh was, I guess, more corrupt than he originally thought. And part of it was saying that we saw these signs early on, but we were blinded by love. We were blinded by, the figure. And that's understandable. That happens. But I think this is the sort of message, this is one of the key messages here that you just really got to be careful. And what tends to happen, particularly for young people, I think, look, I don't want to act as if there's something, we sort of missed. No, I think to some extent we've all been through some iteration of that de facto sort of ascription of holiness or, infallibility or, this is it, this is the haqq, this is the manhaj, right, type of thing. And it's just not it. Like the way I think the way to navigate this is that there's no way that you can have direct access to Islam as such. You do have to go through sheikhs and scholars. And here we could distinguish between what we might call scriptural leadership or revelatory leadership, Quran and Sunnah, وَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَالرَّسُولِ إِن كُنتُمْ تُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. As a function of your very iman, you got to go back to the Quran and Sunnah. But individuals, the vast majority, unless we've got mujtahideen and hiding amongst the youth or something, we don't, right? Or even amongst the older people. Our scriptural authority and leadership is necessarily mediated through what we might call scholarly leadership, individuals. But here's the point to sum up: you have to follow someone or some set of scholars, but we should not confuse them for Islam. They're a particular instantiation, they're a particular school of thought. Follow them, do your best of them, but don't tie your deen to them such that when they fall, your deen falls. And be open enough and humble enough to follow that. When you say it's not Islam, that means it's a probable account of what Allah wants you to do, but it could be wrong. All right, so that means there's got to be a certain epistemic openness, humility, and that allows you to be open to change, to move on, and to understand. So I think those are the sort of broad parameters of how.
So this raises a very important question, right? So there are many cases that don't even come to light, right? Where people in positions of authority, leaders, do things which are very contrary to their positions, right? So they'll behave in a way that's just not befitting of an Islamic leader or a sheikh or whatever the case may be. How should young Muslims navigate that? If they see these signs, for instance, what you just said, right? That there are sometimes signs that appear. Even in some of these recent controversies, there are people saying, "Oh, this just makes so much sense because it explains what I saw early on, or what I heard, or the behavior that I saw, or whatever." And of course, there are some outright famous cases in our communities where people have literally turned out to be frauds, right? But because they could string together some Arabic and deliver a couple of courses and put some quotes online and on their Facebook pages and stuff, people were like, "Oh, this guy must be the real deal." And he claims to have an ijaza, therefore why wouldn't we believe him, right? What is the balance between assuming the good of someone, right, and that sort of skepticism of like something doesn't seem right here. There's signs of narcissism. There's signs of problems. The way that the Sheikh, and this is a common problem, that he lashes out at people on Facebook who disagree with him, for example, right? Who in a masjid, if you ask him a question, he gets irritated if it's like putting him on the spot, right? The way he deals with money, there's something wrong with it. Like it's all about him and sort of he's got to be reimbursed for every little thing, for everything that he does for another organization or giving talks or whatever. All these sort of signs that just sort of make you think like, how does this sit with the ethos of Islam that leaders are meant to embody? What should a young Muslim do? Is it safer to just be like, it's not my problem? Or should there be a culture of, look, I have a responsibility to do something, to call this out or bring it to someone's attention, someone more learned, maybe another sheikh, right? It's a very tough question. And so I want to see some thoughts, because keep in mind what's at stake here. There have been instances where some of these figures have gone on to undertake what would be called emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, right? Where they use their religious authority to swindle hundreds of thousands of dollars from organizations, to do inappropriate things with the other gender, and so forth. So where does hisbah, or enjoining good forbidding evil, come into this sort of situation? You don't have to give me a clear answer, but I'm just interested to see what young people would think, and what, Osman, you think, how we should navigate this very tricky issue.
I think there's a couple of different topics or questions there. Sometimes it's a case of an individual and the sheikh he follows, and so now it's like, what do I do? And another case is, I don't follow the sheikh. So the one where you're sort of saying, can I just sort of, it's not my business. You can't do that when it's your own sheikh, right? That's just living in denial kind of thing. So there's a couple of different issues there. I think when let's start with the latter one, there's sort of clear parts, and then there's the more grey area in the middle. The clear parts are, if there's just suspicion, I think it's very clear. You can't sort of work off suspicion, right? But you can be cautious, and you can see whether things, ensue in a particular direction or not. And then the other clear part is when it's proven, and sometimes for an individual, the threshold doesn't have to be the same as it for society, right? When it's proven, then obviously you take action. You cannot continue and take a non-upright fasiq or whatever, depending on the transgressions. You can't continue to take them as a leader, as a moral authority, right? You move on. You see other people, and usually these are individual cases. It's not a reflection on that particular school of thought. So it's not like Sufi sheikh, so all of Sufism is put into disrepute, or Salafi, or whatever. But you would move on from that. And likewise, in the other case where it's not the sheikh I follow, but it's someone I know about, again, if there's concrete evidence, yes, we need to. And I think this is at least one learning is, yes, a lot of times there are grey areas and it's difficult to answer. That's going to be case by case. But we need more, proper institutional sort of ways of dealing with this, with mashayikh and institutions or individuals, leaders, etc. But I think one thing that's clear is that a lot of times when it's quite clear, it's proven, we don't take it as seriously as it should be taken. But if we took it serious and the person was dealt with strictly and appropriately, it becomes a lesson. And we operate in the same way that in the Sharia it looks at transgressions and makes examples of people as an ibrah for otherwise. So I think the clear example should be treated much more like a lot of these cases. We know them, right? We can name names and whatnot, but the guy just ended up going to another country, start something else, or he's gone missing. I don't know where he is now, right? So whereas there could be some mechanism whereby senior mashayikh or leaders, individuals come together to make a strong declaration about this sort of a thing, so people are sort of put up doing it. But yeah, in the middle area there are grey areas. You can't work off suspicion. You can be careful for yourself, of course you can, and I think people should be more vigilant. But I can't make it a public issue if all I have is a particular suspicion or a particular hunch as such.
Yep. All right. Let's shift gears a little bit. Want to come to something that you mentioned the just before, Osman, and get some of you guys' thoughts about this. So, for a long time, young Muslims used to be embroiled in these manhaj wars, right? And Muhammad might not even know what this is, but going back 15, 20 years, madhabs, non-madhabs, aqidah, which aqidah are you on, Salafi, Sufi, different groups in the community, Ikhwani, Tahriri, etc., etc., etc. And so, there were these sorts of conflicts. These days, the major polarities in the community, right, seem to be on a different sort of fault line. And these are the cultural wars, right? And I want to sort of get a little bit of input from both of you and sense, from Mohammed, what is the feeling on the ground, right? And from Osman, like, what is your take on this issue? And for those who are watching who may be not familiar and maybe lucky enough not to be familiar with it, that's fantastic. But for a lot of people, I think they would at least be broadly familiar with what's going on. And I think if I was to describe it very generally, it would be, in the West there is a massive sort of tectonic struggle, and there has been for really the last 100, 200 years, right, between what we broadly know as the right wing and the left wing, right? And the right wing would be your sort of more conservative, liberal types, and your left wing would be your more sort of inspired by socialism or Marxism or whatever, if you go back 100 years and the communist revolutions that took place in different parts of the world. And in different ways, they've sort of, embedded themselves into the different political parties and the different thinking and the different ways to deal with migrants and things like welfare, and, it touches almost every aspect of life, right? And of late, Muslims have been somehow pulled into this. And not directly, because obviously we're still, couched in the language of Islam, but many of the debates and discussions that have been happening within that part of society are now happening within our society, right? And they've become our discussions. And I'm interested in seeing from you guys, what we should make of this and how we should navigate this. So I think, Mohammed, I'll begin with you. What is the feeling like when it comes to these sorts of issues? And, within young Muslims, at campuses and all that sort of stuff. What would be your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I want to say, so I did see like the tail end of HT in the, and I wanted to talk about that because I thought it was really good for talking about overall narrative to our work, like activism. But on this issue, I've definitely seen this shift, like in the past few years. And I think primarily the way it shows is there's among practicing brothers and sisters who are often, at least in a lot of spheres, like the organizers and, have some power in the community, there's like a strong fragility towards anything that feels leftist. Yeah, anything that, so like, if something sounds a bit feminist or like, it sounds a bit like liberal, like liberal, like there's just like a reaction to it, right? And I think because of that reaction, a lot of times people get burnt because in their mind they're just like, they're standing up for the deen. It's like, this is they're resisting like an ever so advancing liberalization of the deen. So if they see like an instance of it, like someone say something, then they really make a point to like let them have it, right? And that can be like insidious. It doesn't have to be like very like they're telling them off. It can be insidious, like it can be like implicit, but it definitely happens where because of this like underlying fragility, I think like a lot of times there's like overreactions. We deal with we treat problems in a lot more of a messy way than we need to, and in the process lots of people get burnt, and ironically that ends up producing more of these grievances which push people to that in the first place. I definitely see it like play out a lot. I've seen a lot, and I've seen lots of people get burnt in the process because of this defensiveness.
Right. And how is this being spurred? Like, is this being spurred by like prominent voices online who comment on these issues, and then those discussions are coming into the real world, onto within the community and on campuses and all that sort of stuff?
Like, like within the culture wars, and then it spills over to like online personalities. I know on campus, like even just like among young Muslims, it looks like there's a lot of like really like cryptic like online spaces, like threads and all of that, where like, and we're talking about like just even off of like online spaces, like just like general culture. I think like the dealing with women like within men, like women's issues and feminism. That's like a very like in your face thing. But yeah, like it can be insidious, like jokes. It can be like calling a brother like a feminist for suggesting like an idea that's a bit pro woman. It can, and like that. These are like things that build up the base, and then they have like instincts which are more harmful, right? Like because that's the reality like you occupy, where it's so normal to be like skeptical of like women issues and like to be like on your toes and vigilant because it's so normal, which is created by all these other like more banal everyday things. And then when like actual things happen, like you're dealing with some issue with some sister, or like if it's, let's say it's like the homosexuality issue, like when you're dealing with it, then like you see like the actual impacts, and you have like actual like conflict, and that's where like it plays out more publicly. But I think it plays out in a very like banal everyday sort of way. And then it has like touch points which are very like in your face, dramatic and jarring. Yeah.
Osman, what do you make of this issue? You've had a bit to say about this online.
Yeah, here and there. I mean, to one extent, it's inevitable. Again, this is the water in which we swim, and so if the society, if the parent society, if you will, is having these debates, then people are they're going to come down, they're going to trickle down, or you're going to be part of it. But it's just, I guess, it's about more prescriptively. It's about how better we can do it. I think we're still not engaging in this area in a good way, in a mature way, in a productive way. Even it's a lot of times counterproductive. It's sort of copy pasting. It's sort of Islamizing what's not even a Western. It's very much an American version of that. Now, obviously, I mean the culture wars. The basic idea is a struggle of values and beliefs and practices. So I guess ways of life. So struggle between different things that are conceived as different ways of life, and that always happens. But the way they happen and the language that's used and the positions that are taken are historically embedded. That means they're very specific to the local conditions and local scenarios. So because America is such a influential power, those specific realities are sort of exported to the world, and so it's rather counterproductive to sort of copy paste that, or to engage in it in purely a polemical way, or to use it as a base to build a fan base or things like that. So I think a lot of the ways it's sometimes done online, offline, is not very productive, and there's a need for a lot more critical engagement. And by critical, I don't mean criticizing better. I mean critical first of all to understand what's happening at different positions and why this, and then to take a step back and try and see how an Islamic critical position or an Islamic position could be articulated. It's like, and this, as I said, this always happens. If you take a classical example, something like kalam, you get position, you get all the positions, you get positions that are sort of like, this is foreign, having to do with this. And, today we get sort of this. One response to the culture wars is just, this is kufr, and that's kufr, and that's kufr, and that's kufr. It's all non-Islam, right? But classically, the positions that at least historically won out, or in hindsight were worthier, were better, were more productive, were ones that were critically engaged. They took on things while still saying that these are not Islamic. So Greek philosophy, for example, is not fundamentally Islamic. So we're not going to copy paste it, but that doesn't mean it's bereft of anything that's good either. So anyway, that again, broad parameters. I think there's a need for critical engagement, mature engagement, and we don't need to be defensive. I think that's a good way of describing it. There's a lot of defensiveness, and in part I can understand it. In part, I think there's a positive aspect to it, because what people are doing is defending Islam, defending the deen.
It's good to see. Yeah,
there is a positive aspect to it, but that's separate to the question. That's more of an intention question, a motivation, impetus question. But that doesn't. The question of productivity, is it productive or counterproductive, is the best approach, is a different question, and a lot of times it isn't. And I think that's where we need to just have a look and step back and go, okay, have a long-term approach really, and not get embroiled in the nitty-gritty and lose the what's the problem? I always get it wrong. Lose the forest for the trees, or the other way around.
I wanted to add, I think like that makes a lot of sense in terms of we need to do a lot more critical thought and engage with these ideas more closely. I think on like an immediate level, and I think this conversation is probably part of that. But it's for, I think, people that are like quite practicing, or sort of like there needs to be like a lot more compassion in that. Like a lot of people that might say things that even if they're not Islamic, like even if well and truly they're wrong, just like an awareness that the world that's producing this type of person is a very confusing, complicated one, and like they're not going out maliciously trying to change the deen.
Let me pause there, because I want to ask a very controversial question.
Yeah.
Let's talk about feminism for a little bit, right? This like hot button issue that the minute it's mentioned, everyone just like like just freezes up, right?
Yeah.
Let's take that as a departure point, right? Because many sisters in the community, right, who turn to this, whether they're at university or whether in the community or whatever, they often say our community has forgotten us, right? And at least this intellectual tradition gives us some tools to verbalize things like abuse, things like what's going wrong, and so forth. So can you use this as an example, perhaps, as a case study of where if people were approached with more compassion, there may be better outcomes than putting everyone in a box and saying, this person is far from Islam, this person is far from Islam, they've got their deen all wrong, etc. Let's use that as a case study, because I think it's a good one.
Yeah, I think that is a very like common one. I think a lot of people relate to it because, like they might have like women in the family, or like it's just like you go to school and pass the code. I think people relate to it, and it's a very current discussion. And I think like if like some sister, like says something that's like, or starts questioning like, why is inheritance laws like this, or why, and like from in her mind, like maybe she's grown up and like she lives in like it doesn't make sense, right? And then like I think the response, or even if she's like questioning and pushing the notch on like some things that are like Islamic, that this is the way it should be. If she's like questioning it and peddling and saying like, is this the way it should be? Like a lot of people will just get defensive and be like, no, like, we're not like the West where this is kufr and like, Islam is Islam. We're going to be uncompromising. Whereas for the person, I think it might just be like they're trying to reason their way through like what's a confusing matrix of ideas. So, and then in the process of sort of giving like a very ultimatum type answer, or an answer that suggests that the person's not committed to the deen, like in doing that, you push them further away. Because like it's like, yeah, you might have a question, but you don't want to feel like you're still like really Muslim, like you really want to be a good Muslim, like, and part of why you're asking that question is because you've seen things that are unjust and things that might be done under the color of Islam, but what's happening there might be un-Islamic. So yeah, I think that's tragic. What ends up happening.
So let's use another case study, right? Where some people, let's say those people who want to be quite hard and fast about this sort of stuff, they may raise another example. They may say, let's use LGBT as a case study, right?
Like a slippery slope.
Like a slippery slope, right?
Yeah.
So let's say, okay, fine, you start doing that with feminists under or sisters who might be open to some sort of thoughts from feminism under the argument that they've had a difficulty and you want to be empathetic and you want to sort of give room to those sorts of conversations. But then someone else comes along, they say, well, I've had a certain type of sexual orientation because of the broader society. I didn't choose it, and I've been treated really badly for it, and I identify with this, but I also want to be a good Muslim, right? And then like people respond with saying, but that's really, really problematic because now you're sort of acknowledging these foreign like identities or ways of being, and you're normalizing them, right? And they say this is why we can never do it on any issue, not just on this issue, but on any issue, because the minute we start doing it there, we'll start doing it elsewhere, and before you know it, we're admitting all these thoughts in through the door and saying it's okay for people to bring these foreign languages and baggages and say that I can be perfectly fine as a Muslim and still be identifying with that and what have you. So how would you respond to that? Like how would you deal with that sort of contention that for this reason it's better to just be really, really firm, not accept even an inch, and always be as pure as possible and so forth?
That's just not. I would say that I think that's just not. I think it's the wrong approach, but it's not real in a sense. There's many things that we can talk about here, but going back to my example of the classical tradition, you're effectively saying that the majority of scholars got it wrong when they had a critical engagement with kalam instead of saying, let me be sort of hard and staunch about this and just go, no, this is all wrong, right? And I think this is a good way of explaining to people, because most people won't want to be seen, or not seen, but they won't want to find their arguments, put them in that type of a situation. Again, I appreciate that a lot of this is coming from a good place, but the problem is the approach. The problem is the unnecessary defensiveness, and you know, by the way, the slippery slope arguments are most of the time fallacious arguments, because there's no necessary link from one thing to another. But I just think there's no need to be defensive. And in fact, I think the irony is that our deen teaches us to be a lot more confident in it, to be a lot more, you know, just confident in yourself, confident in your deen, and take things easy. And again, it's not about, the idea is not that you open the floodgates, right? You can still, and we should, not you can, we should be strict on Islamic positions, right? But I think we're not talking about that. We're not talking about that you should be, you know, allow some changes or things like this. But we're talking about approach, and here it's horses for courses. It's different. The way you would respond to, you know, some non-Muslim, you know, activist leader of the LGBT community, or feminist non-Muslim leader, would be different to how you would respond to fellow Muslims who may have been affected by those ideas, right? Or not necessarily have some untoward agenda to, you know, take Muslims away from their deen, kind of thing, right? The way you would respond to Western states utilizing feminism or LGBT or queer theory to impose a certain liberalism in the Muslim world, you'd be very strict with that. You'd be very, right? So I think there's a need to make these distinctions. Some people are enemies and people are fellow Muslims who you got to deal with in a much more empathetic way, which I think is the point. It's just you got to be much more empathetic. And when it comes to the deen, there's no need to be that defensive. There's a need to do work, there's a need to da'wah, there's a need to learn, there's a need to, you know, to do a lot. It's not saying be passive, but just I think there's a room to calm down a little bit and do things in the way that they deserve to be done.
I wanted to say, like, on that, like, my feeling is, like, surely amongst Muslims, like, you can be firm but compassionate, you know? But another thing I wanted to say was, I think, like, part of the thing is, like, with white society, like, one of the biggest things is that they frame a lot of the like, even though they're the dominant, you know, they holders of power in society, they frame themselves as constantly under threat. You know, whether that's, so like framing themselves as a minority under threat, as if, you know, whether it's like blacks or Muslims or like these different sexualities that are, you know, going to take over society. And oftentimes it's very like overemphasized, and they can overemphasize it because they're powerful. But I wonder, like, if, I don't know, like, if within the community it's like made out to be a lot more of a thing than it is, like this, like homosexuality, like we're just on the verge of like people becoming, you know, like homosexual, or like, you know, or like we're on the verge of just every Muslim woman like starting to be like super feminist, anti-deen. Like, is it overemphasized? Like, are we, it comes back to the fragility point, like, and the risk is, if it is overemphasized, then that takes away from proper, you know, discussions that might actually be a lot more current and relevant to young people. So I think there's that risk that if we are disproportionate, which I feel like perhaps we are, I'm not sure, it might be an empirical question, then that really, there's a risk there that it not only burns people in the process, makes them further from the deen, but it also takes up lots of space and effort and energy and money in a lot of times as well, from really like current relevant things that might be defining the community in a real way. So
let's talk about that, and that can be the last issue that we discussed, right? So the topic was, what can I do to help my ummah, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, you've got these academic, somewhat academic discussions happening, and people are very invested in defending Islam, and then you've got real problems, right? The community has got raging fires, There's, the other night we talked about a sort of porn pandemic almost, right? Like every second male is like sort of affected by it. You've got drugs, which are a huge hidden problem in the community. You've got these sorts of practical issues, right? Domestic violence, for example. There's so many productive things into which young Muslims could channel their energies to make a real difference. What should a young Muslim today do, right? What causes should we adopt? From the local and the problems that we've got, right up to the bigger ones, right, including changing the global system to be, in line with Islam and what it seeks for the world. Where should a young Muslim channel their energy? What are your perspectives on that? I'll start with Uthman.
I think there's a need to go back to basics and just understand things in their place and really play the long game, which is to say that first of all, we need to get our priorities right in terms of deen, dunya, Allah as the center of our life, as the purpose of our life, the akhirah. And then to play the long game. When I say long game, I mean like you got to set up for the long term. A lot of modern society and contemporary society is built around these short-term gains and short-term, boosts and pleasures and whatnot. And Muslims go along with that. And I think this is more talking to the non-active or non-participating crowd. For one of a better category, but also a lot of active Muslims are into this as well. So I think because there is a lot to do, and no one person can do all of it. But that's why I say we have to get back to basics and understand that there's a few important things that you do need to be doing. Some for yourself and some for community participation, some for the collective aspect of Islam, which is essential to it, right? So obviously at the individual level, you seek knowledge, working on your practice. Having a relationship with the mosque and these things have to be a constant, right? But on top of that, also we don't want to, swimming in those liberal waters, secularize our faith and not have a political aspect, not have a concern and worry for the Ummah, whether local or global, right? Obviously, this is where you're going to have different opinions. I think that we need to work on both areas. Some people are going to be better at one area, others elsewhere, but we should be done in a way where it's complementary. But I think this is the point for youth, again, because there's different discussions here for sheikhs, du'at, people at different levels. For the youth, it's really about the basics. Figure out your priorities and what you need to do, have a longer term plan, and work away at it. Work away at it slowly. But again, have confidence in Allah. Have thiqah in Allah first and foremost, in your deen, that the world's not going to fall apart. And if it is falling apart, Allah is still the author of history. Allah is the author of what occurs. And you're a little part of that, and Allah is trying you in how you react in your given situation. He's not asking you to change the world and change and fix everyone and take everyone off drugs or this and that. It's not that. It's rather that in your given situation, how you dealing with it. What are you doing? How are you contributing? How much are you living for His sake, as opposed to for your own sake or for short-term gains or for the dunya or things like this. So that may not be a very creative or original answer, but I really think that's what has to be done. I've got to do X, Y, Z, and there's obviously more things there, and you got to put your head down and do it slowly and know that it's going to be difficult. Even those basic things, they're going to be difficult. You're going to fall over, and that's life. You just have to get up and do it again and again. And this is why I say play the long game, because a lot of the fruits are seen in the longer term. You don't see them when you're wanting the solutions. When you want to learn Arabic, but 2 months later you want to see the results. Not going to happen. And so many people fall off the wayside because of that. Just take one example, right? And that's an example in sort of the knowledge area. But you can take the activism area. You can take local social work, anything. That's not how the dunya works. There's no shortcuts. So pick your fights, if you will, pick your struggles, or some of them are clear, you have to do, and others you pick them, and you work away at it.
Yeah. Mohammed, what are your thoughts? What are you doing to better the cause of the Ummah?
Yeah, I think Osman, you said something in one of the events last year. I think that on this question that I think resonates with me a lot, because I don't think I have any answers as to what the agenda should be. I think that's a complicated discussion. It happens probably people above my pay grade and so forth, right? But I think as young people, when I look around at the MSA, for example, or even just my friends from outside the MSA, I think the overall approach should be just do more. You have so much time, especially at uni, you have so much time, so much energy, you're probably not as busy as you think, and really just do more, right? And I think I recently left the MSA just recently, and I remember this thing, like looking at someone and just thinking like, like this one person, and like this one person, if they actually bring like passion and energy and like concern for the ummah to this role, like they will actually really move things. Yeah, and like that's just one person. Like if everyone sort of realizes that they are like the holders of difference, right? Like there's lots of power in just bringing passion and energy and concern for the ummah to the table. Like if even 5 more people do that, like at one campus, for example, like that campus, the Muslim life there will like transform. Yeah, and like if you think about that across the community, like it doesn't have to be but like think about across community, like if like all of these people that are just like engaging in like the escapisms that we spoke about, like they spend their, apart from uni, they spend their time just like playing games, watching anime or TV shows or relationships and all. If like some of these people just like you actually just decide that the ummah is my responsibility, like Allah's gonna ask me what did you do, if like that's the mindset, and like just a couple of people actually like put passion and energy into like different pockets of the community, like whatever it is, like dawah, like even like solving, like working in charities, like so many spaces. Like that's, I think it's not hard to figure out once you get to the stage of concern. Like you'll start doing stuff, right? But if that concern gets put on the table, I think like things will just move and change, and like people's hearts will turn. Like I think it just needs to be a realization that every individual can actually make a proper difference should they wish to. Obviously with the fadl of Allah, and like all powers in Allah's hands. So if Allah wills for you to do it, that's obviously the prerequisite. But you need to do something as well. So I think just do more.
Usman, what's the way out of that quagmire, right? People get active, they get hyped, life catches up with them, right? So maybe we end on this thought, because the hadith and the verses from the Quran are there on the dunya and the deen and the length of the afterlife compared to this. What makes people forget, and what is the antidote to this problem? Because it's not like people don't know. They've all heard the talks, they've all heard many Muslims at some point in their life, they've heard of these things, right? But it's like after knowing it, they forget. And that part you mentioned of the constancy of the struggle, the up and down, and reminding yourself, picking yourself up when you work in a 9-to-5 white-collar job, or you're a bricklayer and you've got to work long, hard days in the sun, and then you got to come back and you might as well just watch Netflix with your family. Like, how do we inspire people to get out of this mindset in much larger numbers? Because I think the point you made is right, bro. It's like 10 more active, enthusiastic people in our community could change the ball game of the community. Honestly, it doesn't take many, as the companions radiallahu anhum showed us. How do we do that? How do we remind each other? How do we create that atmosphere of iman and collective, haraka, as it were? What do we do? What's that?
Well, obviously, there's no single sort of silver bullet here, but people have to step up and create those spaces where, because it is in part, the collective aspect of it is very, very important. I think you'll find that the more you're sort of on your own, the harder it becomes. Shaitan, it's easy. It finds it much easier to get the lone person. So we've got to find either we're in the position where we have certain influence and power and resources, so we can help create those spaces, or we're not. We're individuals. We can help join such spaces where we can do that, right? إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. The collectivity, the mutual exhortation of the truth and the mutual exhortation of patience. That's the answer, right? You have to do it collectively, and you have to exhort each other to Islam, to the Deen, to the Haqq, and it's going to require patience. So you're going to read those reminders. So I don't think it's specific to sort of life catching up and whatnot. Everyone has their issues, and obviously once you get married, you get kids, things happen and change. I don't think that's an obstacle necessarily, because it just means you recalibrate your priorities, right? But when you're working on aspects of your marriage or your children, that's still part of the Deen, right? So it's just focus changes. It's just really that. It's just, I don't know. I think at one level the problem is the dunya is deceptive, and particularly in our time, like it's hyper, the escapism and the desires and the hawa. Someone said recently, I was listening to a discussion on liberalism, and someone said liberalism is like the sort of it's the proliferation of hawa, right? In the name of freedom and free choice and this and that. So I think that's really a big issue, and because of that, Muhammad's right. People aren't. It's not so much about there's these 10 things we can do, and I'm doing 3, and I don't have time to do the other 7. They're not doing much, right? In the first place. And again, we should look at that empathetically and see how, if we are, how we might be able to facilitate that. So, and that's the constant struggle. Trying to do it yourself, trying to keep yourself up, remind those who are close to you in your small circles, but at the same time, as part of da'wah imperative, remind others, help them along, and try and do that. And I think again, there is a lot of khair, there's a lot of positivity, there's a lot of Muslims in the community and around the world doing a lot of good things. It's just about, I guess, some approaches are not ideal. We can change them, we can improve, and this is going to be a constant aspect of renewal. But really, I think that's what it comes down to. Go back to the basics, priorities, breaking things down, and then focusing on them and doing them. And there's room for, there's room for variety. It's not that everyone has to be some sort of monolithic assembly line does the same thing. No, people have their own interests, they have their own talents. You can do different aspects because the deen needs so much, but that's really got to be the key. You have to ask yourself, everyone has to ask yourself, am I really living for Allah, and to what extent, and how can I improve that? And we wanted to help each other and hold each other's hand to try and do that better.
Are we running out of time? Or?
No, I think we are. But any final thoughts?
I don't want to end. It might be like a bigger discussion. I was going to say I think part of it's like this, do more and work on what you can, and just start having concern and so forth. But I think one thing is, if we're honest, there has been a loss of an overarching meta narrative to which people can make sense of their work. It's I'm doing what I'm doing is fitting into this broader aim. Goal. And and that really is important, because that gets people they see an end at the end, right? I think there's been a loss of that. I see that on campus a lot, looking at the time when HT was there. Even if people weren't HT, I think that forced others to align or justify their work in some way as well, some end to it. I think that's been lost, and because of that, at least on campuses, and a bit broader than that as well, I think there's a disillusionment, and there's an uncertainty as to what the aim is. But even regardless of that, I think there's so many local communal issues, not even local communal, there's so many things that you can work on if you tried, without that meta narrative. The ultimate aim is just working for the sake of Allah, concern for the Ummah. There's still lots to do, but I think perhaps that's a space of discussion.
It is a huge discussion in itself.
Yeah.
So I guess the most important question that I'll end with is, which Netflix series are you guys watching right now?
Right now. I'll watch
Ramadan
with my kids.
There you go.
Reference.
Brilliant.
But I don't watch it on Netflix. I watch it on YouTube.
There you go. What about you?
Don't want to pay.
What about you, Mohammed?
I'm not watching anything now, to be honest. Yeah, I'm not watching anything now.
That was the answer I was expecting. Keep waiting for the deen, bro.
But I'll start watching Arthur on YouTube, inshallah.
Excellent. We all need the
Urdu dubbing.
So you watch it in Urdu?
Yeah.
Brothers, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. We've actually gone a little bit over, but it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. I understand, brothers and sisters, to those who can hear me, that we have had some audio issues tonight. Our sincere apologies for that. We will try and fix those by next time, and we'll see if we can release this episode with the audio fixed, perhaps, if possible. But thank you so much to the brothers for tuning in, and thank you so much for our audience being there, engaging, interacting, thinking. I've been receiving WhatsApp messages of people with questions. I wasn't able to ask them because there was already a jam-packed list of questions, unfortunately, but we'll make sure for future episodes we do. So once again, apologies for the audio, and just want to end on an important note, which is about tomorrow. So tomorrow's episode, we've got back-to-back nights, is going to be with our very esteemed Ustada Sheikha Jamaluddin, who needs very little introduction to people in our community, and to our sister, and our sister Kalisha Bennett. Our sister Reem Khan will be hosting that particular episode, and on a very, very fascinating topic, prominent, vocal Muslimah, the struggle of being a public Muslim woman. So that's going to be very interesting. It ties into some of the themes that we discussed tonight. The minute a sister becomes prominent and speaks on issues, you've got accusations of feminist and she's too loud and that's not the role of women, leadership, all that sort of stuff. So it'll be a fascinating discussion. It's going to be really, really interesting. So we really hope you can join us then. And we look forward to you being with us. Thank you once again for joining us tonight. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make the rest of your night productive and full of barakah, and for the rest of this month to be also. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.